Greetings and welcome to the Renting in Seattle Landlord Workshop presented by the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections and the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. My name is Dulcie O'Sullivan. I work with the Department of Construction and Inspections, and today I'm presenting with Mike Chin from the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. We also have Maureen Rote, who's the Compliance Supervisor with SDCI, and Monica Beach, who is a Strategic Advisor with the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. They will be moderating the Q&A portion and answering questions during the webinar. We just spent about 30 minutes, 45 minutes talking about the COVID legislation that's temporarily in place because of this pandemic. Now we're going to go to the main portion of our presentation, and we will be covering basically the rental process from listing your property to moving out, from rental regulations as well as fair housing. I'm gonna hand you over to Mike momentarily so that he can just do some housekeeping announcements for those of you that may have just be joining us now and missed the first part, and then we will kick off with the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Right. So before we get started here, we may be experiencing some periodic video and audio quality issues, so we really apologize in advance for these technical difficulties during this live webinar. We will, though, because it is live, we'll continue with the webinar and we'll do our best during the webinar to resolve these issues if they arise. And if you are experiencing any poor video or audio quality issues, you may want to turn off the video or check your internet connections or bandwidth. And because of the number of participants and the webinar platform, attendees will not be able to engage presenters. However, if you do have a question during this live webinar, please go to the Q&A tool available through the platform, and you may ask those questions there. The moderators will consolidate these type questions and will answer the question throughout the workshop. And moderators may also post and respond to some of the questions in the Q&A during the webinar. And if you see problems or have immediate feedback during the webinar, like presentation speed, volume, presentation quality, please share this with the moderators in the Q&A tool. And if you have any unanswered questions or would like to have additional technical assistance or support, you may contact us at Renting in Seattle at 206-684-5700 or visit us at seattle.gov/renting in Seattle. I'm going to hand it back to you, Dulcie.
Thanks, Mike. So our workshop overview today is the story of renting and fair housing in action. So we'll go through finding a renter, the move-in, the rental relationship, and then obviously the move-out. So before you consider renting to anybody, you must ask yourself, is my unit ready? First of all, is it registered? Since 2014, every rental property is required to be registered with few exceptions, and registration renewal is every 2 years, with rental inspections being every 5 to 10 years. And what we're looking to do by registering rental properties is to make sure that they are meeting the minimum standards. And those apply across several different areas. So for space and occupancy, we're looking at minimum floor area for habitable rooms. Light and ventilation, that's the windows, the airflow, fans in bathrooms, that type of thing. Sanitation, which would cover kitchens, bathrooms, plumbing. Structural, making sure that roofs, foundations, and chimneys, all masonry is secure and safe and functioning. Mechanical, which would be the heating systems and the electrical, those should all be safe and up to code. Fire and safety, we look at stairs, emergency exits, egress from sleeping rooms especially, and fire alarms and smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. And then security, which would be the entry locks and having an observation port at the front door. So these are the things that we look for when we are having folks register. You can check the Rental Registration Inspection Ordinance checklist at www.seattle.gov or /RRIO Rental Registration Inspection Ordinance, and you can get a copy of the checklist there if you do not have one currently. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Mike now.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is fair housing and why this is so important to ensure that we're getting the right tenants in your building, as well as making sure that you know what your responsibilities are. So local, state, and federal laws govern housing discriminations, and the Seattle Office for Civil Rights is a local agency that enforces the city's open housing ordinance. And what we do is what we talk about fair housing, it is really the right of every single person to have equitable access to housing and housing services. And we're going to talk about what that looks like in the next slides. But it has to be connected to a protected class. So what Dulcie talks about in terms of making sure that things are habitable, and what she's going to be talking about tenant protections, we're going to talk about why it's important to have fair housing as a part of making sure that units are available to everyone. And everyone is a member of protected classes, and several of us are also a member of several protected classes. So in the chart on the right-hand side, you'll see 18 different protected classes in Seattle. They include race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, familial status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, veteran and military status, age, ancestry, housing choice voucher, political ideology, creed, alternative source of income, and other subsidies. There's a number of these that are different than the federal protected classes as well as the state protected classes, and we are going to talk about those individual protected classes later in this presentation. Remember that fair housing laws apply to all types of dwellings. And so we're talking about apartments, houses, condos, rooming houses, transitional housing, mobile home parks, and cooperatives. Remember, they involve all types of housing transactions, not just in rentals, but also in the sale, mortgage, any type of thing that touches housing. And it involves all types of individuals who are in part of that process, including property owners, property managers, leasing agents, real estate agents, mortgage lenders, homeowners association, contractors who may be doing some work on those housing or residential properties, advertising media, maintenance staff, and other residents. So why are we talking about equity in a fair housing and tenant protections training? So as many of you may know, the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, eliminated individual, institutional, and structural barriers to ensure equal access to housing across the United States. And in the city of Seattle, we have additional protections. We also have our own fair housing protection called the Seattle Open Housing Ordinance. SOCR works to ensure that equitable access to housing is for everyone, regardless of any protected class. So when we talk about equality versus equity, equality is treating everyone the same, but equity gives everyone what they need to be successful. So looking at this picture here, there are two homes that are equal, right? In that the people who live there have a place to live. But we can imagine the differences in the lives of the people who live in these homes. And when we talk about equity and we're talking about equality, you also have to consider other factors that really make a difference in terms of home access. We're also talking about access to transportation, jobs, education, healthcare, recreation, and healthy food. All of these are different aspects of equity. And when we talk about equity, we're really talking about outcomes. I'm a true believer that before we can even achieve equality in our country or in our community, we have to address the equity. We have to go upstream to address all the types of issues that relate to equity. And it's hard to talk about discrimination without talking about bias. So what is bias? So when we talk about bias, we're talking about explicit bias and implicit bias. Explicit bias is the conscious prejudice in favor of or against one group compared with another. But when we're talking about implicit bias, which is a little bit different, it's about the unconscious negative or positive association. For example, you can have a bias about one thing over another. For example, a red car versus a green car. But the implicit bias is what is subconsciously what you think about. And where these biases live, they are learned and positive negative stereotypes that are actually ingrained with us the day we are born. So think about when you were a child. Think about what type of education, the community you lived in, the friends that you played with. Think about the friends that your parents had. All of those are biases that are really created at a very early age. Studies have showed that bias actually exists right about 2 to 3 years old when you're starting to distinguish and notice these differences and changes. Another thing about bias is to understand that bias is always pervasive. It is everywhere. Whenever you don't think you have bias, you have to actually become aware of how your biases actually dictate your behavior. Biases level change. For example, for me, there might have been when I was younger, I didn't like broccoli, and that is a bias that I have. But as I got older, as I began to explore and to taste different ways of cooking broccoli, my bias around broccoli changed. But the thing that we all need to recognize is that most people are unaware of their biases. Think about going into a store. Think about going into Costco or to Safeway, and you're ready to check out. And there's 5 different checkout stands you can go through. But if you choose the line that you think is the shortest and you find out it's actually the slowest line, there's a lot of biases that determine why is that the slowest line? Why did you choose that line? And how did that line become the slowest line? All of those are some of the biases that may play out in your mind. The other thing about biases is really understanding how biases actually determine behavior. And so when those behaviors actually manifest, it shows up as microaggressions. Microaggressions are verbal and nonverbal behaviors that communicate a hostile, derogatory, or negative message about or at a protected class. And so examples of a microassault, there's 3 different types. There's actually micro-invalidation, micro-insults, and micro-assaults. So microassaults examples would be name calling, using racial slurs, avoiding people, discriminatory behavior, bullying. Those are actual behaviors that manifest an assault on someone who may be subjected to that treatment. A micro insult examples would be, boy, you are very articulate, or how can you afford that house? Or when I was growing up, one of the comments was, boy, my English is very good. All of those insults may have an intention not to harm, but it has an impact about how I perceive myself and how others perceive each other. And micro-invalidations would be, an example would be, I don't see color when I look at you, or we're all the same, or we don't see race as a difference. All of those can be examples of how micro-invalidation of someone's experience in the United States or in a community that's aimed to mitigate or to minimize someone's experiences with regards to bias or microaggressions. Now that we've learned about some implicit bias and microaggressions, which is really our thoughts and sometimes manifest in actions, let's see how these concepts relate to fair housing. So, who would you most likely rent to? And which people do you associate with most? These are all the questions that we all face on a daily basis. Every time you're working with a prospective applicant who comes through the door, you are automatically thinking about different types of thoughts that might come across, because we know that in these 8 pictures, there's actually different messages that are being sent to you through your brain, right? For example, you see an individual in the first picture on the left side of an individual with a disability, right? You also, in the lower picture on the right-hand side, you see someone who's pregnant. All of these biases actually determine how people are treated. And as much as we try not to treat people differently, right, because that's illegal, Our biases inform how we engage and how we don't engage, or we either encourage someone to rent here or maybe discourage someone from renting in the building. So what we have seen is that biases always have shown in the past years that OCR does testing, it shows up in our testing reports. And that's one thing to recognize, that we do a number of different in-person, phone, and email testing in Seattle. And our testers go out and they're trained to basically gather information. And what they do, we sometimes will send them out. We provide them, they're kind of like secret shoppers going into and basically evaluating the information that is their interaction and the information that they gather from a housing provider. But it is a way to gather information about how individuals are being treated based on a protected class. And here are some common trends that we've seen. For example, on race, we've seen that Black applicants more likely to be informed we do criminal background checks, or some sort of statement that would indicate based on race that they may have a criminal background check. And of course, in Seattle, there is the Fair Chance Housing Law that prohibits asking that, and we're going to cover that information a little bit later in our slide. Or Latinx applicants were more likely to be asked about income requirements. Or for gender identity, non-cisgender testers were more likely to be steered away from renting a unit. Or if someone with a housing choice voucher, which is a protected class as well, is less likely to provide a response to the rental inquiry. All of these are examples of how biases show up in our fair housing test. But in general, we have found that 66%, or 2/3 of the tests, when we send out testers to gather information and engage with housing providers, show some level of difference in treatment. And a lot of that difference in treatment can be tied to some of the bias that individuals may have about the applicant coming in. So I'm going to talk specifically about how our biases, how our thoughts, how our microaggressions can result in action. So when we talk about types of discrimination, we're talking about a type of action against someone based on a protected class. And these are the main types of theories of discrimination: difference treatment, disparate impact, harassment, retaliation, reasonable accommodation or modification, or the refusal of providing that, and retaliation. I'm showing this slide now because we're going to go into a greater details of examples of this, but I do want to cover a couple of these that we don't have designated slides on. So for example, different treatment is where you treat someone differently because of their protected class. For example, you decide not to renew someone's lease or someone's because of their race. That would be different treatment based on a protected class. Disparate impact is a little bit different. Disparate impact is when you have a neutral policy or practice that has a discriminatory impact on a protected class. We're going to talk a little bit about harassment and retaliation, and reasonable accommodation. We have a whole section about that because we know that there's a lot of questions about disability and reasonable accommodation. So let's talk about harassment. So there are 4 components that landlords and housing providers should know about harassment. It is an unwelcome or offensive behavior based on a protected class, okay? It could be verbal, it could be visual, it can also be physical, like physical contact towards someone. All of that is unwelcome. And remember, if it's unwelcome to an individual, then, and it's based on a protected class, that can consist as harassment. The next element that we look at is whether the behavior or the conduct was severe or pervasive. And it could be a one-time incident. It could be an ongoing incident. It could be those little microaggressions that occur over a period of 6 months or a year or even 2 weeks. And it can also be directed based on a tenant-to-tenant harassment situation. So it's not always in the situation that a landlord or a housing provider is harassing a tenant. It can also include tenant-on-tenant harassment. The third prong is that landlords knew or should have known. And one thing to think about, or one thing to ask yourself, if it's actual means you knew that this harassment was ongoing. You knew that the harassment was going on between two tenants in your building and it was based on race. That is actual notice, right? Or an actual notice example would be when a tenant comes to you and said, I'm being sexually harassed or racially harassed by so-and-so. That is actual notice. Constructive notice is where you should have known that the harassment was occurring. Okay, so for example, maybe someone didn't come to you and tell you about it, but you noticed that there was graffiti on someone's door that was basically racial slurs. That is actual notice, and it's constructive notice for you to take action. And the fourth prong is landlords fail to take action, which can take in many different forms. When you notice, you actually have to act and respond. You can investigate the situation, take action, and to monitor to make sure the harassment does not continue. One thing that I want to talk about is xenophobia and racism disrupt the safety and resilience of our communities by misdirecting fear and anger towards people instead of the root cause of harm. This can result in bias or hate incidents targeting neighbors, businesses, or communities. We all play an essential role in creating communities free of hate, bias, and exclusion. And it's so important for us to understand what bias is and what to do if we experience or witness an act of bias. A bias incident is any incident that is directed at you because of your race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, national origin, and so many other protected classes in Seattle. But it can include things like racial or ethnic or sexist slurs, intimidation or cyberbullying, telling jokes based on stereotypes, xenophobic or racist graffiti or images. If you experience or witness an act of bias, we ask that you report it to the Seattle Office for Civil Rights Anti-Bias Hotline at 206-233-7100. You can also report these incidents online going to our website at seattle.gov/report bias. These bias incidents reporting is easy and it can be done anonymously. We asked about basically 10 questions and it would take a few minutes of your time. It is so important that we start to track when bias is happening so that as a community, as policymakers, and as a city, we can start to respond to these incidents of hate. And always remember that physical violence, property damage, or threats may be a violation of criminal law and can be reported directly to the police by calling 911. Do we have any questions so far from our audience? All right, hearing none, I'm going to go to the next slides here. Finding your renter. Dulcie?
Thanks, Mike. So now we're on to the part where you're finding a renter, and we're going to talk about the application and specifically the costs. So in Seattle, a landlord can only charge the actual cost of the screening, which is approximately about $45 per adult. A holding deposit, that's what a tenant can pay to reserve a rental unit while the landlord is processing the rental application. That is regulated by the State Landlord Tenant Act, and you are required to provide a written receipt explaining the terms if you charge one of these holding deposits. It can't be withheld if the tenant fails your screening criteria or if the unit fails an inspection by a rental assistance program. Holding deposits, like I said, are regulated by the state statute, and you can find that under RCW 59-18-253. We're ready for the next slide. There we go. So also, the city does have occupancy standards. You'll find them under the Housing and Building Maintenance Code, and these describe minimum floor area and light and ventilation for habitability purposes. For example, a room that is designated for sleeping must be at least 70 square feet. That will cover up to 2 people. And then for each additional person in excess of 2, an additional 50 square foot is required. However, we don't regulate how people use their living space. For example, some people may decide that they want to sleep in their living room on the couch or something like that, especially if they are a larger family. There's nothing for us to regulate around that. But putting arbitrary occupancy limits in rental properties can be potentially a fair housing violation if, for example, a family is denied access to a rental unit because of those limits. I'm going to hand it back to Mike now for this portion, which talks about first in time.
Great. So as some of you may be aware, that first in time is now fully enforced. The Washington State Supreme Court made some decision that first in time is lawful, and it is something that the Seattle Office for Civil Rights is currently enforcing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basics around first in time, because we haven't really talked about it for some time, and I just want to make sure that we have an understanding of it. The first thing about first in time, there are notice requirements. So first, landlords must provide written notice of the criteria used to screen applicants and the minimum standard a person will need to move forward in the application process. So as a landlord, you should be starting to think about all the documentation before you even advertise your unit. Like, how are you going to screen the applicant, and what are the minimum standards that you're going to require all applicants that you're going to consider to move forward in the application process. You should list all information, documents, submissions necessary for the landlord to determine if the applicant meets those criteria. And written notice about how to request additional time to complete an application if needed to ensure meaningful access or reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities. And we're going to talk a little bit about meaningful access in a later slide. Also, if you are providing a unit that is either required to or voluntarily set aside for units for vulnerable population, you must also note that in your notice requirements. And remember, when you talk about notice requirements, we're talking about in your advertising. So every time you are advertising your unit, either putting up a sign in your yard or putting up a sign or something on Craigslist, you should also not just include the description of the unit and the amount of rent and when it's available, but also letting tenants know or letting applicants know what is required so that they don't waste your time and they don't waste your time or their time in applying for the property or the unit. I'm sorry, that was a little bit delayed. Can you still see the slides? Okay.
Yes.
So in first in time, the application and chronology. One of the things about first in time, where it got its name, is that you look at the first application first before you move on to the second. So it's kind of like the same concept, like you stand in line and the first person in the front of the line gets to be considered first before you go to the person behind you. So when we talk about application and chronology, this is also really important to follow. Make sure that you are required, and it's actually required by the ordinance, to note the date and time when the application is submitted, okay? And you should think about it as like date and time stamp as the application is received. Whether if you're receiving it by email, that date and time can be received, could be stamped on when it was received in your email inbox, or if it's by mail, it's received in your hands. So it's not the date that it was sent, it was actually the date it was received, and so forth. You're also required by the ordinance to screen the completed applications in chronological order. So whoever is the first application received in your email inbox or by mail or handed in person, that should be the application you look at first. You should also offer the tenancy to the first applicant who meets your minimum criteria. And that's why there's so much emphasis that I can share with you is that you really need to make sure that you have an understanding about what your minimum criteria and the qualifications for applicants. Because if it's not clear in your mind, it's definitely not going to be clear to the applicants who are applying. And that is going to be the criteria that you're going to have to look at, is that if this is the criteria and if this is what you're looking for, you have to stick with it during the entire process. Once you have offered the tenancy to the first applicant who meets your criteria, you can give that applicant 48 hours to accept that offer. And if the applicant does not accept within 48 hours, the landlord can move on to the next applicant. One of the things about this application process, which is also important that you should note as landlords, is that an application is complete when the applicant provides all information and documentation listed in the landlord's notice. So you can see why this is also really, really important as well. Because if you are not providing all this information on the front end, and you're not able to evaluate the individual because the criteria was not correct, or you didn't ask for all the required qualifications, you may have to start all over an entire process again to set out the proper notice and screen the applications as they come forward. Also, another thing to remember is that if someone comes and only fills out their name and phone number and leaves the entire application blank, that is not a complete application, and therefore it's incomplete, and you can now consider the next person in line. However, if the application is complete and everything is filled out, but let's say that you, for example, on your application have a tenant that you're asking for rental history, and the telephone number provided by the applicant is no longer in service for the landlord, you can reach out to the applicant and say, hey, I tried to contact and get a reference based on your application, and this number is disconnected. You can provide the applicant up to 72 hours to provide additional information so that you can then continue with that screening process. And if they do not provide that information within the 72 hours, and of course 72 hours is minimum, you can also provide more time than the 72 hours, the application can be considered incomplete. And if it is incomplete, you can go on to the next applicant. And let's talk a little bit about meaningful access, because this is a really important aspect that we want to ensure, and it's also aligned with fair housing, is making sure that everyone has access to housing. And this includes individuals who may require language services or assistance to successfully complete the application. What this means with meaningful access is that if an applicant approaches the landlord and they say they would need additional time to fill out the application, and the person has limited English proficiency or need a translator or interpreter, you should be engaging in that process to identify what an appropriate amount of time would be for that applicant with limited English to be able to provide that information. It does not require that the information they provide to you is in their native language. They still have to provide it in English so that you can do a proper screening, but you do have to give them additional time so that they can get an interpreter or translator to be able to understand the questions in your application, gather the documents that they need and provide it to you in English, and be able to get that in time. If you do provide someone with meaningful access, their date and timestamp is when they had requested the meaningful access. Okay, so it's not when they submitted it. So for example, if they were to get back to you with all the information a week from now, it's not a week from now that is their date and timestamp, it's the date that they had requested the meaningful access. And also, however, at the landlord, you can deny the request for additional time under meaningful access if the amount of time is unreasonable. So for example, if someone needs 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, that amount of time to submit an application may be unreasonable because for you need to fill your unit or fill that unit and have someone in there as soon as possible. And number 2, requires reasonable documentation of the need for additional time. So you may require additional documentation to support their need for language services or assistance. One thing about landlords must document the date and time, which I had mentioned before, And if the request is accepted, this date and time will serve. I think I mentioned that. I also mentioned if it's requested or is denied, the date and time the application complete is the date and time receipt. And if the request is accepted, landlord requires documentation of per need time. And I think I've already covered that in the previous slide. So let's talk a little bit about alternative sources of income and subsidies, because this is a new protected class that's unique to Seattle. And I know it has been expanded through the state, through statewide and other jurisdictions across the United States. So let's talk a little bit about subsidies and alternative source of income. When we are talking about alternative source of income, we're talking about any income that is not derived from employment. So for example, it can be Social Security payments, it could be pension, it could be alimony, child support, anything that is not from employment. Also, just to note, it has to be lawful. So if it's illegally obtained income or considered income, the landlord may not consider that as a source of income if it's illegally obtained or unlawful. So let's talk about what is a subsidy. Subsidies can include short-term or long-term subsidies from a government, nonprofit, or other assistance program. Most subsidies that we hear about is subsidies where a third-party provider pays the landlord directly for a portion of the rent, and the remaining portion is on the tenant to pay for that difference. So one thing to remember about source of income protection is that you cannot discriminate against applicants or tenants who use alternative sources of income or subsidies to pay for housing costs. It does require, under this ordinance, that housing providers cooperate with subsidy programs. So for example, it is even, for example, Seattle Housing Authority, a landlord cannot say, we're not going to allow an inspector from the Seattle Housing Authority onto the premises to do an inspection. You do have a requirement and to follow and to cooperate with subsidy programs, including inspections, if that is important, if that's a part of to qualify for a subsidy. Income screening requirements exist for calculating income to rent ratio. So remember, we'll do some math calculations a little bit later about what that means. But if you have a 3 times the rent, incomes of 3 times the rent, you actually have to consider alternative source of income and subsidies in that mix. And it requires housing providers to accept written pledges of payment issued by subsidy program to pay for past due or current housing costs. This is something to also note, especially in times of COVID, is that there have been some housing providers who have been having concerns about accepting written pledges of payment, especially for tenants who are not able to meet their tenant or meet their rent obligations of their lease. They are required to cooperate and to accept written pledges of payment. So from third-party payers or from other sources to be able to become current on their rent. And also the last point, which we haven't seen a lot of in Seattle, but it does require, it prohibits preferred employer programs in the city of Seattle. And what preferred employer programs is when an employer will say, if a housing provider will say, if you work for this particular company, we're going to give you 10% off your rent. That should be applied to anyone regardless of where they work. So I had mentioned to you a little bit about some math in this presentation. And so I wanted to illustrate the income screening when you're looking at the rent to income ratio. Okay, so step 1 is you have to determine what is the tenant's total monthly income by adding all the verifiable sources of income. Okay, and some examples of that below can be on a monthly basis, and that could be Social Security, one-time veteran stipend, child support. Okay, and in this scenario, the tenant's total income is $900. Step 2 is you determine the tenant's portion of rent by subtracting all the verifiable subsidies received from the monthly rent. And so if the monthly rent is $1,200 and the veteran assistance subsidy is $1,000, the tenant's portion is $200. Okay, so step 3 is that if you calculate the tenant's required income by multiplying the tenant's income portion by the ratio. And you determine the qualification by subtracting the tenant's total income from the tenant's required income. So in the scenario, you can see that the applicant total monthly income was $900 and their rent portion was $200 a month. So if you had an income to rent ratio of 3:1, this individual would qualify for this particular unit, because if you times 200 times 3, that would be 600. And so they would qualify and meet the 3:1 ratio. Now there is no provision that requires a 3:1. You can do 2:1, or you can not have the income requirement at all. But whatever it is, you have to consider both the alternative source of income as well as the subsidy in your mix. And this is another way to look at something where an individual may not qualify under these situations. I'm going to talk also about fair chance housing, which is a relatively new ordinance that the Seattle Office for Civil Rights enforces. And this law was actually something that had been years and years generated from community input involvement to some laws on the federal level and some guidance that was provided by HUD around the use of conviction records. And so Seattle decided to take some of the movement that was that we're hearing from community, as well as movement from the federal level, to start taking this into action and to address where criminal records have an impact or adverse impact on certain communities of color. And so this is an ordinance that caps a decade-long effort to address bias and barriers for people with criminal backgrounds facing when attempting to secure rental housing. And we're going to talk about each of these provisions in the next coming slides here. First of all, fair chance housing does have some exclusions, so I want to cover that first. It does not apply to federally assisted housing subject to federal regulations that require denial of tenancy for lifetime sex offender registration or conviction of meth production in public housing. Those limitations are very, very narrow, and those are things that are on the federal level required to automatically exclude individuals who may have these type of convictions on their records. It also does not apply, fair housing does not apply to rental housing where the owner occupies a part of the unit. So for example, if I was renting out a room in my unit or sharing space with a tenant who's not related to me, the fair chance housing does not apply, and I could screen that individual for criminal history. Also, fair chance housing exclusion also does not apply to accessory dwelling units or detached accessory dwelling units where the owner maintains a permanent resident on the same lot. So using that same example, if I have an ADU, I can decide to screen the applicant for my ADU to go through a criminal background check, because if I am living in that unit and that is my permanent residence and I'm renting out the ADU, I would be excluded from fair chance housing. So here's some other provisions to also take note. In the box in the graphic, you'll see the actual language that has to be included in your rental application. It has some specific language that under Seattle Fair Chance Housing Ordinance, Seattle Municipal Code 1409, landlords are prohibited from requiring disclosure, asking about, rejecting an applicant, or taking an adverse action based on any arrest record, conviction record, or criminal history except for registry information. And it provides some of the exclusion and the legal requirements in that law. So when we talk about adverse action, we're talking about denying tenancy based on having a criminal record. Okay, so denying tenancy or evicting someone or failing or refusing to add an individual to a lease or applying different terms and conditions. These are all can be considered adverse action based on screening someone with a criminal history. Okay, and the other things in advertising, you must include, very similar like in first in time, include minimum screening criteria for all information, documentation, or submissions necessary to meet criteria, and provide meaningful access or reasonable accommodation for disability. And remember, If it's a legally required to or voluntary set aside, make sure you include that in your advertising as well. And it's just a recap of both fair chance housing and what we covered in person time. So if you are going to use registry information, and what that is, it's like sex offender registry information, a housing provider may take an adverse action against a prospective adult occupant, an adult tenant, or an adult member of the household if the conviction occurred when the person was an adult and only if there is a legitimate business reason. So if you are a landlord are thinking about screening someone and wanting to take into the registry information, you have additional steps and requirements to do so before you can take an adverse action, okay? And remember, the biggest things to take away from this slide here is that if the person was a child or a minor and committed the crime as a minor and convicted as an adult, or was a minor and who was committed the crime and convicted, you cannot use that information at all. It can only occur when the person was an adult. And so if you decide to do this, you have to also consider the legitimate business reasons. And some of these factors are, for example, demonstrating a connection between the policy and practice and resident safety and or protecting property, and consider various factors such as the nature and severity of the crime, age of the individual at the time of conviction, the number and type of offense that occurred. Also, you have to consider evidence of good tenant history, time since the date of conviction. So if it happened 40 years ago and the person has had a clean record since then, that would actually show that would be a big factor of whether you should actually consider the person for the rental, and any other supplemental information. So remember that if you are going to consider registry information, you have to put it into your rental minimum criteria to let the tenants know that, and you have to give them opportunities to provide supplemental information and consider all of these factors before taking an adverse action against the individual. And remember, if an applicant or tenant is denied, the landlord must provide written notice and state specific registry information that was the basis for the denial, must provide name and address of consumer reporting agency to address the incorrect records if they are incorrect, and is prohibited from retaliating against the applicant or tenant based on the information that was gathered. Are there any questions before we move on?
Hi, Mike. No, there are questions, but I'm answering them as they come along, mostly about first in time and source of income.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica, for your help.
Hi there. So it's back to me, and we're now at the moving in section, and I'm here again to talk about costs. So Seattle limits what a landlord can charge a tenant to move in. It's important that people distinguish between fees, which are non-refundable, and deposits, which are fully refundable. Fees in Seattle for move-in purposes can only be charged for screening or cleaning, and they're limited to 10% of 1 month's rent. So it's probably unlikely that most of you would be able to recoup the cost of cleaning if you're limited to 10%, and that has to cover fees for applications also. Also remember, if you do charge for cleaning up front, you can't charge for cleaning at the end. Security deposits and fees combined can't exceed a total of 1 month's rent. So the total you can charge for the security deposit and fees combined can't exceed a total of 1 month's rent. The only exception would be if you had, for example, several adults sharing a household and the actual cost of their application screening exceeded 10%. That would be allowed for you to charge the actual cost of screening. Okay, we're ready for the next slide. Also, landlords can charge pet deposit of 25% of 1 month's rent. That's for one pet or 3 pets, it's 25% capped. You can also charge last month's rent in advance. And please remember that pet deposits do not apply to service animals. Mike will be going over service animals in a little while. And so you'll be able to learn about what applies to service animals and what applies to pets. So here is an example of move-in costs. We have Tracy. She's a single person household with a dog. The rent for the unit that she's moving into is $1,200 per month. So Tracy's landlord can charge her a screening fee, which would be, we'll say, $45. That would leave out of 10% of 1 month's rent, $75. So the landlord could charge Tracy $75 cleaning fee if they wanted to do that. But remember, no cleaning charge at the end of the tenancy if you opt for that choice. The security deposit would be a maximum of $1,080 at 90% of 1 month's rent. And then on top of that, the landlord could charge a $300 pet deposit for Tracy's dog. So her total move-in costs could equal up to a maximum of $1,500. In the next example, we have a 4-person household, Hamid and Fatima and their 2 children. Their rent is $2,200 per month. Their landlord can charge the screening fee for the 2 adults. The balance would be $130 of 10% of 1 month's rent. So if the landlord opted to, they could charge $130 for cleaning, and then a security deposit of $1,980. So their total move-in costs would equal up to a maximum of $2,200. They don't have a pet, so they're not paying any pet deposit. Also in Seattle, a tenant has a right to opt to pay their deposits and fees in installments. You don't have to offer that upfront, but certainly if a tenant says, I want to pay in installments, you can't refuse. You can't charge anything extra for somebody who wants to pay in installments. For a 6-month tenancy or more, the tenant could opt to pay 6 equal monthly installments. For a tenancy that was between 30 days and 6 months, 4 equal consecutive installments. On a month-to-month tenancy, a tenant could opt to pay in 2 equal installments. Again, there's no installments for deposits or fees if the total does not exceed 25% of 1 month's rent, which would be rare in Seattle these days. And then the pet deposit could be split into 3 equal installments. For last month's rent, again, 6-month tenancy, the installment payment can be arranged over 6 equal consecutive monthly installments. Between 60 days and a 6-month tenancy, 4 equal payments. Again, like I said, no fees or penalties or interest can be charged for installment payments. If a tenant fails to pay their installments as agreed, it's a breach of the rental agreement, and you can issue a 14-day notice to pay or vacate. The other option is to come up with your own installment plan by mutual agreement with your tenant. You just want to make sure that it's in writing and that the terms are clear. So when it comes time to enter into a rental agreement, you want to make sure that the rental agreement you have is applicable to your specific place. Use a comprehensive agreement specific to Seattle. Seattle has a lot of regulations that do not exist outside of the city. And so it's important that you use a comprehensive agreement. Remember, your rental agreement is sort of your first line of protection in terms of being able to enforce the rules and regulations and the terms. I always suggest that you review carefully with your tenants. Not everybody chooses to do that, but it's a good business practice if it's possible. Some of the areas that a tenant needs to especially understand when they're entering into a rental agreement is, what is the term being offered? Is it a month-by-month tenancy, or is it a terminating lease? Meaning, does it end at its expiration with no option to continue unless the landlord decides? That should be made clear to a tenant so that there's no confusion if at the end of an initial lease term, the landlord chooses not to renew. What costs besides rent are tenants responsible for? So any other charges associated with the rental should be clear to the tenant at the time of before you enter into the rental agreement. What are the rules about guests? Does it include the required information for tenant summary, which is a requirement under the rental agreement regulation ordinance? We are currently working to update the information for tenant summary. It should be published in the next couple of months. For now, the information for tenant summary as is not currently up to date, but until we publish a new version, landlords are fulfilling their obligations by providing the one that we do currently have. And then, very important, does the rental agreement have a detailed and complete move-in checklist? If you want to make sure that you have full access to a security deposit at the end of a rental term to cover you for damages to your unit, then the more detailed and complete your checklist is, the better, because that is what you'll rely on when your tenant moves out. And if it's too vague or it's not complete, you'll have a difficult time making the argument to keep any security deposit. So now we're moving into the actual rental relationship and all the things that can come up between landlords and tenants once a rental agreement is entered into. Rent payments, the definition of rent changed recently to include utility payments. The 3-day notice to pay or vacate changed to become a 14-day notice, and now you can include utility payments on that, whereas before you could not when it used to be a 3-day pay or vacate notice. Landlords have to provide receipts if tenants pay rent in cash and when requested for other payment types. And landlords must give tenants a non-electronic option to pay rent, which includes periodic charges such as third-party billing for utilities. So now we're going to talk about repairs. Tenants are required to make repair requests in writing. You are required to respond to issues promptly. You should document your efforts, and there are specific timeframes in which to respond depending on the nature of a repair. If you don't respond and the tenant reaches out to code compliance for help at the Department of Construction and Inspections, the way it works is an inspector will schedule a day and time to inspect the unit and then write up a notice of violation requiring the landlord to correct anything that is not in compliance. And that could be more than what the tenant initially complained about. So really it is a good idea to respond promptly to your tenants, get those repairs made, and then you won't have to deal with an inspector going through your property, spotting things that maybe they wouldn't need to have spotted if they didn't have to come out in the first place. When we do come out right away, same day usually, is if there's a lack of water, power, and heat. We consider those emergency conditions, and we give a very short window, usually 24 to 48 hours, for a landlord to correct those conditions. You have a right to access the rental unit with consent and proper notice. So you need to give 1 day or a minimum of 24 hours if you're going to be exhibiting the unit to prospective renters, buyers, or lenders. And then 2 days, which is a minimum of 48 hours for inspections and agreed upon repairs or improvements. Your renter can reasonably deny access, but they should be prepared to offer alternative dates and times. If your renter is arbitrarily withholding access, you can issue a 10-day notice to comply or vacate for refusal to permit access. The only time that you can enter without notice and consent would be in an emergency situation, and it would have to be fairly apparent, like a flood or fire or something like that, or in the case of abandonment. And you'd want to have several reasons to determine that the unit's been abandoned before you would let yourself in under those circumstances. So non-payment of rent, non-communication from your tenant, maybe mail that's not being collected in the mailbox, the neighbors haven't seen the tenant, something like that. Before you could actually let yourself in, you'd want to make sure that you have several of those reasons to believe that the unit has been abandoned. So common types of notices that you would be issuing as a landlord. So housing cost increase, which is rent and any other cost that's associated with the rental of the unit. It's a 60-day advance written notice if you're going to be increasing any housing costs. Obviously, that applies to month renters. You can't increase costs during a lease term unless it's by mutual agreement. 14-day pay or vacate. That is now the notice that you have to issue when rent is not received by the due date. It can include utilities and also late installment payments of move-in costs if your tenant has opted to pay their move-in costs in installments. 10-day comply or vacate is when you consider your tenant in violation of the rental agreement. Do not use this for any type of payments. It's not allowed anymore on a 10-day comply or vacate. So it should be about breaking the rental agreement rules. For example, smoking in defiance of a non-smoking rule, something like that, or keeping a pet. Those would be, or noise disturbances. Those would all be appropriate for a 10-day comply or vacate notice. And then for month-to-month agreements, or at the expiration of a lease term, if you wanted to change the terms, for example, if your unit was allowing smokers, but now it's not allowing smoking, that would be a 30-day advance notice of a change to the terms of the agreement. Notices that you issue, it's very important that they are technically correct. If they're not, then they can be considered deficient. And if our office reviews them and finds them deficient, then we will require them to be rescinded and you'll have to start all over again with notices. So pay attention because there are city and state technical requirements. Remember that you have to be registered under the Rental Registration Inspection Ordinance before issuing an eviction notice. So if you're not registered, you can't even issue a 14-day notice to pay or vacate or a 10-day notice to comply or vacate. Failure to issue proper notices can make them invalid, as I said, and risk delays in the eviction process. You need to attempt personal service, but failing that, you need to serve notices by both posting conspicuously, just like the image shows on the right-hand side. We often get tenants calling us very, I suppose, alarmed that a notice has been posted conspicuously on their door, but we do explain that that's actually a requirement of the landlord. But if you are posting it, you also have to mail it and allow an additional day for those notices to reach the tenant through the mail. So pay attention to the details because they matter a lot in terms of procedure and getting things technically correct so that you can move forward to a court action if that needs be. Very important, notices must include this language. All notices must include this language in the City of Seattle. If you need help understanding this notice or information about your renter rights, call the Renting in Seattle helpline or visit the website. So make sure that's on all of your notices or they will be considered deficient.
Are there any questions before we go to disability?
So we did have two questions in relation to the most recent slides that Dulcie was presenting. One is in regard to the cap on pet deposits. The question is, can you charge per pet?
The answer is no. It's 25% total, whether it's one pet or 3 pets.
And the second question involves month-to-month fees. This overlaps a little bit with the moratoriums. And if there were month-to-month fees prior to the moratoriums going into effect, can they be charged during the moratorium? You know, the moratoriums really prevent an increase in housing costs, increases to rent, things that weren't in place before the moratorium started. So as long as there's no increase in what the tenant is paying, then those month-to-month fees would continue to be charged just as they had been prior to the moratorium going into effect.
Yes, absolutely. Maureen, well answered.
Any other questions, Maureen?
I can take care of the rest on the chat.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to go into disability, and this is an area where we're going to spend a little bit more time because that is probably one of the most common questions that we get from a technical assistance standpoint and in our trainings is around reasonable accommodations and modifications, when someone has a disability and a disability related need. So one thing I wanted to also share with you are some statistics, is that fair housing requires that dwellings provide equal access to housing. And that's actually the root of where reasonable accommodation and modification comes up. And over 50% of all of our housing discrimination cases that we see at OCR are disability related complaints, and many because of the failure to grant reasonable accommodations or modifications. And reasonable accommodations or modifications may be necessary due to the person's disability. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is a disability and what can be requested and how to engage in that interactive process in the next few slides here. So this first slide talks about the definition of disability. And this definition of disability is also mirrors the Washington State Law Against Discrimination, RCW 4960 definition. It is any sensory, mental, or physical impairment that could be medically diagnosable or diagnosable, or could exist as a record or history, or perceived to exist whether it does or not. And so I'm going to break this down because I think it's so important to really understand that when we talk about disability, we're not just talking about physical disabilities only, or things that are visible type disabilities, but it's anything that's medically cognizable or diagnosable. Okay, and it does not require that person to give you those records of what their disability is at all. Okay, the second prong is that it exists as a record or history. So for example, if you have an applicant or a tenant who was a cancer survivor and their cancer is in remission, they could still be considered a person with a disability, whether it actually exists now or not. Okay, so it's a record or history. And the third prong is perceived to exist whether it does or not. And what that means is that even if the person doesn't have a medically cognizable or a record of a disability, either sensory, mental, or physical impairment, but if someone is treating that person differently because that disability is perceived to exist, that could be discrimination under the fair housing laws. Other things to consider about disability is that it can be temporary or permanent. For example, if you have a tenant who broke their arm or broke their leg or something, and it's only going to be on a temporary basis that they're going to need assistance, while they're in that stage, they are considered a person with a disability and may request a reasonable accommodation. It can be a common or uncommon type of disability, and it also includes mitigated or unmitigated. And an example of mitigated or unmitigated would be like, for example, glasses. When I wear my glasses, it mitigates my disability, but when I take it off, it's unmitigated. So one of the things that I also want to point out is that there is some really strong data around how many people in the United States have disabilities and how prevalent it is. And this is why it always comes up in our office, because it are a lot of time these disabilities are not even the common types of disabilities that you and I may be familiar with. But 61 million US adults, about 1 in 4, have a disability that impacts a major part of their life. And the most common disability types, for example, which is mobility, affects about 1 in 7. And when we talk about mobility, we're talking about physical types of disability. And with age, disability becomes more common, affecting approximately 2 in 5 adults aged 65 and older. And the most common type of disability are actually in younger adults that have cognitive disabilities. So you can see that as when we talk about disability, it actually affects all ages and all types of disabilities across this country. And so when we talk about disabilities, it's also important to identify some examples of mental disabilities. For example, anxiety disorder, attention deficit disorder, autism, major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. All those are things you cannot see, but they are mental, and those are considered disabilities. And some physical disabilities examples are, for example, arthritis, asthma, carpal tunnel syndrome. Recovering from alcohol or substance abuse is actually considered a disability. Severe vision impairment, cancer. But then there are some examples that we don't include in this list that does not qualify as a disability, such as sex offenders, current users of unlawful drugs, pregnancy, stress, or body weight are not considered disabilities. So we're going to spend a little bit of time about what is a reasonable accommodation and modification. And I have to say that in doing this work, a lot of times people will use that interchangeably, but there are some distinct differences between the two. And so I want to make sure that we cover both of those so that you have an understand of what some of those type of accommodations could be asked for when a person with a disability is requesting it. So reasonable accommodations are a change in rules, policies, practices, or services that provide an equal opportunity to the individual to enjoy their dwelling. Okay. While a reasonable modification are typically changes to a physical structures that may be in the unit or common areas, and generally the resident pays. However, if the building is a recipient of federal funds, the housing provider is responsible for that cost. So when you think about reasonable modifications, it's actually the physical changes to the dwelling or common area. And when you're thinking about reasonable accommodations, it's really the changes in rules and policies and practices. And so here are some examples of reasonable accommodations and modifications. Reasonable accommodations can be an accessible parking. Okay, it's not, and it's a little bit different. Sometimes people think, well, is that considered a reasonable modification? No, because if the parking is already there, it's actually an accommodation to actually create that space for the person with a disability. Rental documents in large print. For those who have vision impairments, that might be something that you need to provide to that tenant so they'll be able to understand, be able to read and understand those rental documents or those notices. Moving transfers upstairs or downstairs based on a disability. Those are examples of reasonable accommodation. Some examples of reasonable modifications are widening a doorway. So for example, if you have a tenant who's using a wheelchair and they're not able to go in and out of their bedroom, it may require widening a doorway for them to have access into that room. Installing grab bars is a prime example, and it's probably the most common example that we see where someone has a disability and has a disability-related need in their bathroom to be able to go in and out of their bathtub, for example. Installing grab bars would be something of a modification. Replacing doorknobs with lever handles. I can say that for me, sometimes it's hard to be grabbing the doorknobs that are round to be able to twist and turn, but lever handles sometimes make it a lot easier. And if you're a person with a disability, that can make a huge difference in being able to go in and out of your unit. And lowering a closet rod. That could be an example of someone's need to be able to place the items and hang up items in their closet, and lowering it will be able to give them that access to using their closet. So now we're going to talk a little bit about service animals. And I know that Dulcie a little bit earlier had already alluded to service animals and pet deposits, but we're really going to talk about just the service animals and what that really means. So first of all, assistance animals are also known as service animals, companion animals, and emotional support animals. One thing to keep in mind is that under fair housing laws, emotional support animals, companion animals are considered service animals or assistance animals. That is different in employment and also in public accommodations, where the state has narrowed the definition of service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act to be very limited to providing a training requirement and to provide a specific service to the individual. So remember, you cannot conflate both assistance animals in housing with employment and public accommodation. And that is a common mistake that we hear that comes up, that they treat it the same, and they're not. And like I had mentioned before, you cannot have a requirement that animals are trained by service animal school, or that the animal owner has to provide some sort of documentation that they are trained to provide that certain sort of service to the individual. And there is no such thing as certification of service animals, as there is no state national standard for what constitutes certification, but can request verification letter from qualified third party if necessary. And we're going to talk a little bit about in the next slides about the verification process. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And then also, as a reasonable accommodation, if someone has a disability and a disability related need for a service animal, the housing provider must waive pet policy. So even if a building has a long existing or long-term policy around no pets, or they charge a pet fee, or have pet deposits or pet rent, or have a no dog policy or breed restriction, service animals are the exception to this rule. If they are a service animal, some of these policies are going to have to be modified for that particular individual. It does not mean that your entire building now becomes pet friendly, or that you cannot regulate the control of pet deposit or pet rent for every single tenant. It is only for the person with a disability and disability related need. And I cannot emphasize that enough, because one of the things that does come up for a lot of times when we talk about fair housing laws, we talk about treating everyone equally and not discriminating. Well, in fair housing laws, reasonable accommodation and modification is an exemption to that general rule of non-discrimination, because you are providing an accommodation, you are providing additional services or something unique to the person with a disability that you do not have to provide everyone else. So please remember that reasonable accommodation is on a case-by-case basis. So you can't say, well, we provided this accommodation for this person with this type of disability. You cannot assume that that's going to be the thing that's going to be effectively addressed as a person with a disability related need for an accommodation or modification. So we're going to talk a little bit about the verification process. So when can verification be requested? That's a very common question that we get from a technical assistant and in our trainings. Well, when the disability is not known or obvious, or when the need for the accommodation is not known or obvious. Okay, so for example, if the person says, I'm a person with a disability, and this person says that they have a disability related need for a parking space for them, okay, or they need a ramp. And if it's not clear from visually seeing them that they have this disability, you can request verification of their disability. Now remember, it is not required for the person to disclose what their disability is, but that they are a person with a disability under the law. Okay, so for example, if a third-party provider, when I talk about third-party provider, and that's kind of in the third bullet, I'm kind of jumping ahead. In the third bullet about who can provide the verification is any qualified third party with knowledge of the disability and the need for the accommodation. Okay, it does not require a doctor or physician or nurse practitioner to verify this. It can be someone who knows, who can make the call that the person is a qualified individual with knowledge of the person's disability and disability-related need for that particular accommodation. Okay, and what can be requested? Verification of the disability or the verification of the disability-related need, but it does not require the disclosure. There is no right to obtain medical records during this interactive verification process. And here, this diagram kind of illustrates what that accommodation and modification process looks like. So remember, an accommodation or modification can be requested by the individual, okay, at any time of the tenancy. It could be as an applicant, it could be during the tenancy, it can be up to the very last hour or the last day before their tenancy expires. An accommodation modification can happen at any time. It can be written or verbal. So it does not require that they provide a long description or fill out a form. As long as it's verbal and is communicated to the housing provider, that is sufficient to be a request. The next step is the interactive dialogue. And when I talk about the interactive dialogue, it's an ongoing conversation between the individual with a disability and the requested accommodation and what the landlord or the housing provider can do to provide that accommodation, if that's even possible. So it's an interactive dialogue. One of the things that we see at the Office for Civil Rights is where someone says, I'm requesting a reasonable accommodation, and the answer from the landlord or housing provider is no. Once you close that interactive dialogue and you say no, that's basically refusing to even consider a reasonable accommodation or modification. So one of the better answers to say instead of no is, how can I help you? How can I understand why you need this reasonable accommodation? What is your disability-related need for this? Tell us more. All of those are great opening questions that housing providers should consider when engaging in that interactive dialogue. The third piece is documentation. And I already covered this already, but a third party verifying disability and accommodation if necessary. And the caveat is if necessary. If it's clear that you have a tenant who is in a wheelchair and comes to you and says, I need a ramp to be able to go up the 1 or 2 steps into my unit, that should actually be enough of a verification, and it wouldn't necessarily need a third party to verify their need. But maybe it is. It's on a case-by-case basis, but it's something that you should consider all the time. And the fourth one is it has to be an effective solution. And what that means is not going to be 100% of what the tenant wants or 100% of what you're willing to offer as an accommodation. It actually has to be an accommodation that will accommodate the person's disability-related need. One thing to also remember about the reasonable accommodation and modification process is that it can also be ongoing. Just because you provide the accommodation, if later that accommodation actually doesn't address the person's disability-related need, you may need to go back the steps and engage in the interactive dialogue to find another effective solution. Because if the effective solution isn't working, it's not an accommodation or modification. So it may require a couple of interactive dialogues. One of the things to also remember is that it is very time sensitive. So one thing that would be considered a denial of accommodation or modification would be an example if you receive an accommodation request and you don't act on it. By not acting on those accommodation requests or modification requests is actually constructive denial of providing the accommodation. So when you do receive these, make sure you address them in a timely way and an appropriate way. Here are some examples of where you as a housing provider can deny the accommodation or modification. Number one, if the individual has no disability. Okay, so for example, if I come to you and you're the landlord or the housing provider and I say, I need a disability parking space and I don't have a disability, you as a landlord or housing provider isn't responsible to provide me that accommodation if I request that. Another thing is that if it creates undue financial or administrative burden. And what that means is that we're looking at the entire portfolio, the entire building, the entire rent income and revenue when we're looking at financials. Not just the financial aspect of that one particular unit, it's actually the entire portfolio that has to be considered. So if it created an undue financial hardship or administrative burden, you can deny the accommodation. So I'll give you an example of an undue financial hardship. If you're a small landlord and you own a duplex, and on the second floor of that duplex, the tenant has requested that you build an elevator so that they can go from the ground floor to the second floor into their unit. If that is your only property and that is your only revenue income, or those two units, that actually would create a financial hardship for the landlord to put in an elevator for that duplex. But remember, it's on a case-by-case basis, and we're not here to provide you legal advice if that might be your scenario that you're facing. Administrative burden would be an example where it would create too much of a process to actually administer that accommodation. Now remember, administrative burden would not be making your rental agreement in larger font. Okay, that would not create that may require you to go to Kinko's or to some other store to actually make those in a larger print, but that would not necessarily be an administrative burden. Direct threat could be a reason to deny the accommodation. When we talk about direct threat, let's say you have an example of someone who has a dog, and this dog has known to attack residents, to attack little children, to tear up the floors in the common areas or in the unit. If someone says, I have a disability-related need for that service animal that's causing all this damage, and there's a history and record of this, and it's actually causing direct threat to other individuals or property, that would not be an accommodation for that particular animal. Okay, you cannot use your bias about certain types of animals. For example, if you have a chow or if you have a pit bull, that all pit bulls are going to cause damage or attack other residents. Fundamental alteration of services, example of that would be when a resident has asked you that, hey, as a disability related need, I need someone from maintenance to come up to my unit and make my bed and take out the garbage and clean and vacuum and things of that nature. Well, if that's not part of your fundamental services that you provide your residents, it does not mean you have to provide it for that person with a disability. And not structurally feasible. Not structurally feasible are examples mostly in modification. So for example, let's say that widening a door area or taking out a wall would actually cause some structural instability in that building, like it's a load-bearing wall or something that would actually cause the structure to be unsafe to live in that dwelling or in the building. That would not be an appropriate modification in that situation. Of course, I'm generalizing this, and so remember, it's a case-by-case scenario, and they all really depend on different situations. The most important thing is engage in the dialogue with the tenant to find a suitable solution. Monica, are there any questions for me at this point?
Hey, Mike, there are questions, but I'm catching them all. Some is about definitions of service animal, and then sort of the logistics about reasonable accommodations and modifications.
Great, thank you so much. And by the way, I know there's a lot of questions throughout this, but we do encourage you to contact us at Renting in Seattle, because when you do contact us and ask for more information or contact our office directly, we'll be able to provide you the technical assistance on specific questions that you have after this presentation.
Hi everyone, it's Dulcie. I'm back again. We're on our final section, which is the moving out portion. I've been trying to keep an eye on the Q&A while Mike was going through his slides. And I see that our moderators are doing an excellent job of responding to a lot. I do see there are still COVID-19 related questions coming up, and I would encourage you, especially around specific situations you're experiencing, I would strongly encourage you guys to call the Renting in Seattle helpline, because we can get into the details then, where this is just not the forum for doing that right now. So call the 684-5700 helpline, and we should be able to talk to you and answer your specific scenario related questions. The other thing that I forgot to mention when we were talking about the COVID-19 section is that we do have translated FAQs that are designed for renters. And we have those in the 12 major languages spoken by people in the city of Seattle. And I would strongly recommend that you access those and give those to tenants who don't speak English as their first language. The material clearly explains that rent is still due, but it might help with confusion, because we are getting some complaints and concerns from community members who do not speak English as their first language. And so there's a lot of confusion and misinformation. So use those FAQs on the seattle.gov Renting in Seattle website. It's on the first page, on the main page. If you just scroll down, I think they're helpful. And also for landlords who maybe don't speak English as a first language, they'll give the basic information. Okay, so on with our current portion, moving out. So if you have a month-by-month tenant, they have to provide a minimum of 20 days written notice prior to the end of the month that they want to move out, which means that you are supposed to have that in your hand 20 days prior. I'll use this opportunity as well, since several questions came up in the Q&A about notice. Somebody asked if you can just send an email or a text. Email and text is appropriate for things like repair requests, if there's established, if there's an established line of communication between landlord and tenant around that. But anything where you're changing or altering or the terms of a rental agreement, or you're wanting to collect rent or anything like that, that should be actually in writing, hard copy, and served as the slides described earlier. It's not okay to just use email and text for that. There are a couple of minor exceptions to that. I believe if a tenant is wanting to give a landlord notice that a repair is required under when a rent increase is going into place, I believe that there is an exception that can be done electronically, but I would just assume that anything that is major or impacting the rental agreement at all needs to be hard copy. Okay, so failure to give proper notice can make a renter responsible for the following month's rent. So if you have a month-to-month renter and they don't give you a minimum of 20 days written notice before the end of the month they want to move out, they would be responsible for the following month's rent. If you want to terminate a month-by-month tenancy in the city of Seattle, there are 18 just cause reasons, and those all have specific notice periods depending on the cause. So for example, 90 days advance written notice is required if you want to occupy the property for yourself or for your immediate family, or if you're selling a single family dwelling unit. For example, if you're listing it for sale and you want the tenant to move out, it's a 90-day advance written notice. It's 20 days notice if you are the landlord and you are sharing your own home with a renter and they are month-to-month tenants. You can give 20 days notice for them to move out just because you no longer wish to share your own home. We're ready for the next slide. Okay, so some other just cause reasons, a 14-day pay or vacate that the tenant has not paid, habitual failure, so that would be if you had to issue 4 14-day pay or vacate notices in a 12-month period. The same with the 10-day comply or vacate. If a tenant doesn't correct the non-compliance, then that could be a just cause reason, and or habitual failure where you're caused to issue 3 or more 10-day notices within a 12-month period. Also, more than 8 unrelated renters in a single family dwelling unit. That would be also another just cause reason. Some just cause reasons require payment of relocation assistance. So if you are displacing tenants because you're demolishing your property, or you're doing a substantial rehab, or it's going through a change of use, for example, from a hotel, or excuse me, from an apartment building to a hotel, something like that, or there's a use restriction such as a tax incentive for affordable rentals, if that's dropping off, for any of those reasons, then potentially the tenant is looking at getting relocation assistance. If you are renting out an illegal unit and it has to be discontinued because it's a zoning violation that can't be corrected, that would also require payment of relocation assistance to the tenant. If the tenant is displaced because of an emergency order that we have issued to vacate and close the building because of an imminent health and safety risk. So again, going back to one of my earlier slides, if there is no heat, there's no power, a major sewage leak, something like that, that cannot be remedied or is not remedied, then we would issue a vacate and close order, and the landlord would be responsible for paying relocation assistance. Also to remember that tenants cannot waive their just cause rights, nor be required to sign a lease that results in the termination of their tenancy. So once a tenant has been month by month at any point during their tenancy, they have those rights. And even if they were to sign something that ended with their lease terminating, that would be non-enforceable. So if you are going to issue a notice for just cause, you have to state that just cause reason on the notice, and then whatever facts that you need to support it. The correct notice period must be provided. You can be required to certify for the record if your tenant disbelieves the stated just cause and makes a complaint. So for example, if you give your tenant a notice to say that your mother is going to move into their unit and therefore they have 90 days to move out, and they don't believe that your mother is moving in, they can reach out to us. We can require you to certify. If you refuse to certify, it provides a defense to an eviction. If you certify and or if you fail to follow through with the stated just cause and we get a complaint about that, we can assess a $3,500 fine, and the tenant can pursue their own right of action in small claims court for up to $3,000. So some details around the moving out procedure. Exit walkthroughs are not required by law, but we definitely recommend them as a good idea if possible. Some tenants think that they're required and they'll call us and say the landlord's refusing to do an exit walkthrough, but there really it really is a good idea so that you and your tenant can have some understanding about the condition of the unit at the time that they're leaving. Definitely document the condition of the unit once it's vacant. Take videos or pictures if needed. Remember that if you have charged a cleaning fee at move-in, you cannot charge for cleaning when the tenant moves out because you've already assessed that cost. Tenant's obligation is to leave the unit in the same condition as when they rented it, minus reasonable wear and tear. And reasonable wear and tear is basically something that happens gradually over time from normal use versus abuse or negligence. So paint fading on the walls, or some smudging, carpet treads from people just coming back and forth. Those would be reasonable wear and tear items versus a hole punched in the wall or a burn on the carpet, which would be considered damage. Remember, if the tenant does not provide a forwarding address for the return of the security deposit, use the last known address, which would probably be your own rental unit. So one of the newer bills that have been introduced in the last 12 months is the Domestic Violence Damage Relief Bill. And that means that tenants who experience domestic violence cannot be held liable for damages to their rental unit that are caused by their abuser. A landlord mitigation fund was created to reimburse landlords who repair damage in rental units that was caused by DV perpetrators. The tenant has to provide documentation to the landlord that they or an occupant was a victim of domestic violence and that the perpetrator caused the damage. And that documentation has to be signed by a qualified third party, which would include the Seattle Police Department, licensed mental health professional, domestic violence program advocate, clergy, or social service case manager. The effective dates are the ordinance went into effect on January 1st and the Landlord Mitigation Fund is effective July 1st. So eviction. Eviction is the legal process by which a landlord asks a court to restore their possessory right to the rental unit. There's no other way for a landlord to remove a tenant from the rental unit. So locking a tenant out, disconnecting utilities, strictly prohibited. And if we do receive complaints from tenants with these types of situations, we call the police immediately and we usually get them involved. And there are potentially criminal charges associated with actions like that. So the eviction process begins when a landlord serves the tenant with a notice. If the tenant fails to comply with the notice within the notice period, then the landlord can serve a summons and complaint upon the tenant. The tenant has to respond to that summons by the deadline or risk a default judgment. And then the show cause hearing is where the landlord presents evidence to support their case. Again, the tenant must appear or risk a default judgment. Landlords absolutely should rely on legal representation for any eviction action, because if you make a single technical error on any of the paperwork, then defense attorneys for the tenants will basically get the process stopped at that point. So it's just not worth it. You need legal representation if you're going to have to evict tenants, and that's just a fact. So your obligations regarding security deposit return, you have 21 days to return the deposit and or provide a statement for the basis of retention. The statement should reasonably itemize deductions so it's clear to the tenant where their deposit is going. You have to rely on your move-in checklist to establish that damage has been done to the unit. Reasonable wear and tear is not damage, and you should consider depreciated value. So remember, if a tenant moves into your unit and the carpet is 5 years old, you can't consider damage to that carpet like replacing a new carpet, because it's clearly not new, and at 5 years in a rental property is probably near the end of its effective life. But the important thing is to make sure you get that deposit and or statement to the tenant within 21 days and that you clearly itemize what's on there. When we can get involved in a complaint about security deposits is if you don't make that 21-day deadline. A tenant can make a complaint to us and we can intervene at that point. If you don't reasonably itemize the statement, so if you just put a sentence saying $2,000 security deposit for damages, that clearly would not meet a reasonable standard. Or if you made the fatal error of not providing a checklist at the time of move-in, then 100% of the security deposit would be absolutely refundable to the tenant, even if they had done damage to the unit, because you would have taken it unlawfully if you took a deposit without a checklist at the time you rented the unit. Things that we don't deal with are disputes about damage or outstanding bills. That would be better dealt with at small claims court or using the dispute resolution center. So before I hand back to Mike, I just wanted to check in with Maureen and see if there are any burning questions that we need to address before the last section of the presentation.
We have COVID-19 moratorium questions related to notices that tenants can give.
Okay.
Both questions relate to if the tenant wants to move back into the property. As of now, the only notices that can be given that would ultimately displace a tenant are those notices that there is an imminent threat to health and safety. I don't see an avenue for these notices under the existing moratoriums.
Yeah, correct. And that's why we did the training this way today, because we have this unprecedented pandemic situation that we're trying to deal with and that legislators have put temporary measures in place for. And then we have what happens when things get back to normal, which is the presentation we're doing now. So again, if we didn't get to answer your COVID-19 related questions, I encourage you to use the helpline. You could also email us through SDCI's on a web portal. You can go on there and you can email us also, and or call us at 684-5700. Thanks, Maureen. I'm going to hand it over to Mike now.
Great, thank you so much. So we are on the final stretch here, and I'm so appreciative that you are all sticking in with us as we make the last couple of slides here. And then towards the end, we'll be able to ask some general questions that you may have. One of the things that we also wanted to kind of make sure that as you are ending the termination or ending the rental relationship, is to also consider that different terms and conditions still applies. And so even after a tenant vacates the property, it is illegal to subject the former tenant to discriminatory terms and conditions related to reimbursement security deposit, provisions of landlord references, either positive or negative, or other charges, fees associated with the damage to unit, unbalances, and miscellaneous items. Remember, it becomes a fair housing and a discrimination issue if it's based on the individual's protected classes. So remember, it could also be a situation where you have a complaint, you have a tenant who files a complaint with both the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspection for a possible violation of tenant protections, as well as a fair housing protection where they believe that they are being subjected to different terms and conditions based on a protected class. In either way, we're going to both departments are going to look at these and look at both of how that potential violation of tenant protections or violation of fair housing could be implicated in both of those situations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about retaliation. And retaliation is a word that people use in common language. And the type of retaliation we're talking about today requires objecting to an individual, a tenant or resident, objecting to a discriminatory practice protected under the fair housing laws by reporting it to a housing provider. And I will also kind of even expand this, that retaliation is a protection not under fair housing laws, but also under tenant protections. I know that there are situations where SDCI may consider as potential retaliation in different situations. But I'm going to talk about it more in the context of discrimination and retaliation. So if a tenant is evicted after telling a manager that they believe they were being discriminated against, okay, so That could be an example of that would be they filed a complaint with the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, or participated in a discrimination case, or somehow associated with an open discrimination case that we're looking into, or potentially making a request for a reasonable accommodation, or making a harassment complaint to the landlord. All of those are protected under fair housing laws, and all of those are going to be protected activities under fair housing. The tenant is written up because they helped another tenant file a discrimination claim, or a tenant is raised after testifying. If there is some sort of adverse action that there's a nexus between the protected activity and an adverse action made by the housing provider, that could be grounds for retaliation and a potential violation of fair housing laws. However, this does not apply to other types of complaints. If there was a complaint to SDCI about a tenant protection, and then all of a sudden some adverse action and they come to OCR. But it's something to be always in the back of your mind, is to think about how certain actions afterwards may have an impact on the tenant and how they may perceive that as a potential civil rights violation. And always remember that a retaliation claim may be supported even though the original claim was unfounded. And when I say that, it's an example of this where, let's take the different terms and conditions, where someone believes that they're being, they didn't get their rental, they didn't get their deposit at the end because of their race, but then as a retaliation, the housing provider, the landlord, decide to not give, takes some sort of adverse action by letting other landlords know that this person is a bad tenant. That could be considered retaliation, even if the original claim was unfounded around the tenant not getting their damage deposit based on the protected class. So here are a few final thoughts that we wanted to share before we close this live webinar. Really, a simple rule of thumb is to consider how you would feel as a renter in any given situation and make sure that you're responding accordingly. And that's probably why you're here today, is to learn about what are those tenant protections, what are the fair housing protections, and what are your responsibilities as a housing provider to ensure that you're not just violating law, but you're also making sure that all renters and applicants who apply for housing have a fair share or a fair opportunity to housing. And whenever you have any questions or doubt, reach out to us. Call the Renting in Seattle helpline for guidance. We are here to help you. We provide technical assistance, we provide trainings, we also do outreach events and attend outreach events. We're here to support not just tenants, but also housing providers, because we know that you are the gateway, you are the key to ensure that fair housing is protected for everyone and that tenants have the ability to know that their rights are also protected. And the third bullet is, there's a lot of different resources out there, including landlord associations across the state and in Seattle. We encourage you to reach out, talk to attorneys, talk to housing associations, talk to people who are experts in this to get good advice. So many times when you get wrong advice or you misinterpret the law, which can be very easy to happen, or sometimes you have a misunderstanding or ignorance. Remember, if you make a mistake, ignorance, or anything else like that, that is not defense to a fair housing complaint. You are still on the hook, and that is why it is really important that you get the information to prevent any sort of fair housing violations or tenant protection violations. Are there any questions at this time?
There don't seem to be any new questions, except someone didn't quite hear Maureen during the end of the last round and had asked for the question again.
So the question from the last round was about notices of intent for the owner to move into the property and giving an eviction notice essentially with cause that the tenant or the owner intends to occupy the property. The answer was there are no exceptions for that type of notice built into the moratorium. So while the moratoriums are in place, that type of notice could not be issued.
Thanks, Maureen.
Are there any other questions that we have from our audience today?
We have a question about certifications, Mike.
Service animal certification or?
No. Certification for attendance.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the reminder. So for those of you who are attending the Renting in Seattle webinar, live webinar, before we leave today, I will be emailing you, or I'll be sending in the Q&A tool the contact information for someone in our office with some information that you can send to us that you have met the requirements for today's training. And so the information we're going to ask is your name, the building name, if you have a case number associated with that, and also who attended today's training. And so I will be sharing that information in the Q&A before we leave today. Thank you so much for that reminder. Are there any other questions today? All right. Well, thank you again for attending the Renting in Seattle training and live webinar. And we really, really appreciate all of the work that you do as housing providers and making Seattle a great place to live. If you do have questions or need technical assistance, we invite you to call our helpline at 206-684-5700 or visit us at seattle.gov/renting in Seattle. There's a lot of great resources in multiple languages, even our fair housing poster, a lot of documents that will be really helpful to you as housing providers in Seattle. And also, on behalf of the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspection and the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, thank you for making Seattle a place where everyone belongs. This concludes the webinar.